August 6th, 1945, 8:15 in the morning. The radio operator at Tokyo's Central Broadcasting Station pressed his headphones tighter against his ears, confused. Hiroshima had gone silent. Not the silence of a city asleep, but the silence of a city that had ceased to exist. 20 minutes later, small railway stations 10 miles from the city began transmitting fragmented, incoherent reports. A terrible explosion, a flash brighter than the sun, everything gone. In the mahogany-paneled conference room at Imperial General Headquarters, Admiral Sumu Toyota listened to the reports with narrowed eyes. His fingers drummed once, twice on the polished table. The Americans claimed they had dropped a single bomb, an atomic bomb, on Hiroshima. One bomb, one city. The mathematics were impossible. The Admiral's own scientists had told him that producing fissionable material was stupendously difficult, perhaps impossible on any meaningful scale. This had to be propaganda, a psychological trick to cover a massive conventional raid. But the photographs arrived the next day, where the center of Hiroshima had stood, home to 340,000 souls, headquarters of the Second Army, warehouses full of supplies, streets bustling with morning commuters. There was nothing. Just ash and shadows burned into concrete, and a mushroom cloud that had climbed tens of thousands of feet into the stratosphere. For the first time since the war began, the men who had led Japan into conflict with America confronted a truth they had spent 4 years denying. They had never understood their enemy at all. Private First Class Takeshi Yamamoto had expected to die the moment the American soldiers surrounded his position on Okinawa. Every officer had told him the same story. The Americans were barbarians who tortured prisoners, who had no concept of honor, who would violate every principle of civilized warfare. Better to die by one's own hand than fall into their clutches. But Takeshi had taken shrapnel to his abdomen, jagged metal that had torn through his intestines and left him barely conscious in a crater filled with mud and the bodies of his comrades. When the Americans found him on April 28, 1945, he was too weak to reach the grenade he'd kept for precisely this moment. He waited for the bullet, for the bayonet, for whatever cruelty would come. Instead, a medic, a boy who couldn't have been more than 20 years old, knelt beside him and began cutting away his uniform. "Jesus Christ," the American whispered, not to Takeshi but to himself. "We need plasma, now." Takeshi's Japanese was good enough to understand English, learned from school books in what felt like another lifetime. But he couldn't process what was happening. The medic's hands were gentle as he inserted a needle into Takeshi's arm. Another soldier arrived with a canvas stretcher. Within minutes, Takeshi was being carried away from the front line, morphine flooding his system, turning the agony in his gut into something distant and dreamlike. "You're gonna make it, buddy," the medic said, though Takeshi wasn't sure if the American knew he could understand. "We've got you." The field hospital was a marvel of organized chaos. Takeshi, fading in and out of consciousness, watched through morphine-hazed eyes as doctors in blood-spattered surgical gowns moved between tables. American soldiers lay on some tables. Japanese prisoners lay on others. The same doctors treated them all. When Takeshi woke after surgery, he found himself in a tent with clean white sheets, an IV drip in his arm, and a drainage tube running from his abdomen into a collection bottle. An American nurse, a woman, impossibly, was checking his vitals. She smiled when she saw his eyes open. "Welcome back," she said in halting, accented Japanese. "You're one lucky guy. Doc says another hour and you'd have been gone from peritonitis." Takeshi tried to speak, but his throat was too dry. The nurse held a cup of water to his lips. The water was clean, cold, without the metallic taste of the canteen water he'd been rationed for months. "Don't try to talk yet," she said. "You just rest." In the days that followed, as Takeshi slowly recovered in a POW hospital in Saipan, he began to understand the magnitude of what he'd been taught to believe versus what actually existed. The food alone was beyond comprehension. Breakfast was scrambled eggs, real eggs, not the pickled vegetables and watery miso that had sustained the Imperial Army. Fresh bread with butter, coffee with cream and sugar. For lunch, thick stew with chunks of beef, mashed potatoes, canned fruit. The portions were so large that Takeshi, whose stomach had shrunk from months of near starvation, couldn't finish half of what was served. He wasn't alone in his shock. The other Japanese prisoners whispered among themselves, voices filled with bewilderment and something approaching betrayal. They had been told that America was starving, that its economy was collapsing under the weight of the war, that every Japanese soldier killed brought the enemy closer to exhaustion and surrender. "This is what they call rationing?" one prisoner said, staring at his dinner tray. "Pork chops, green beans swimming in butter, a thick slice of cake for dessert. This is what they feed prisoners?" Another prisoner, a lieutenant who had graduated from the Naval Academy before the war, sat silently for long minutes, studying the medical equipment in the ward. Chrome-plated surgical tools, sterile dressings in unlimited supply, electric fans to keep the air moving in the tropical heat, quinine tablets for every patient, preventing the malaria that had decimated Japanese forces throughout the Pacific. "We were told they were running out of everything," the lieutenant finally said, his voice hollow. "We were told that one more battle, one more sacrifice, and they would have to negotiate. But the evidence before their eyes told a different story. American soldiers rotated in and out of the hospital, many of them complaining about minor ailments, a twisted ankle, a mild infection, dysentery. They received immediate treatment. Antibiotics flowed freely, mysterious sulfa drugs that conquered infections. Japanese doctors could only watch helplessly as they killed their patients. When an American soldier needed dental work, he received it. When he needed new boots because the old ones were worn out, he got them. Takeshi had worn the same boots for 14 months before his capture. They had holes in the soles patched with canvas. Many of his comrades had marched barefoot. The dissonance gnawed at him during the endless hours of recovery. He had been raised on stories of Japanese spiritual superiority, of American moral weakness, of Bushido triumph over materialist decadence. But if America was weak, if it was on the verge of collapse, why did even its prisoners eat better than Japanese officers? Why did its medical care extend equally to friend and enemy? One evening, a week after his surgery, an American doctor sat beside Takeshi's bed. The doctor was older, perhaps 50, with gray hair and eyes that had seen too much suffering. "Your English is pretty good," the doctor said. "Mind if I ask you something?" Takeshi hesitated, then nodded. "What did they tell you about us, before you were captured?" The question hung in the humid air. Takeshi considered lying, then decided there was no point. "They told us you would torture us, that you killed prisoners, that surrender was worse than death." The doctor was quiet for a moment. "And yet here you are." "Here I am," Takeshi agreed. "Do you know why we treat you like this?" the doctor asked. "Not because we think you're less dangerous. We know damn well what you did to our guys. But because this is who we are. This is what America means, even to our enemies." Takeshi didn't respond. He didn't know how to. "There's something else," the doctor continued. "Something I think you should know, since you understand English, and you seem like you can handle it." He pulled a folded newspaper from his pocket. Stars and Stripes, the military newspaper. The headline was 2 days old. "Atomic bomb destroys Hiroshima." The doctor's face was somber as he handed it over. "I'm sorry. I know a lot of you guys probably have families there." Takeshi read the article 3 times, his hands trembling. Not from shock, though the destruction described was beyond imagination, but from the terrible clarity it brought. The bomb wasn't the point. The bomb was simply proof, final and irrefutable, of what he had been refusing to see. America had built a weapon that required 10,000 scientists, billion-dollar facilities, industrial infrastructure so vast it could produce fissionable material, while simultaneously building hundreds of thousands of planes, millions of tons of ships, enough food to feed armies on 6 continents. The bomb was just the ultimate expression of something that had been true all along. Japan had been fighting a nation that operated on a scale it couldn't comprehend, let alone match. In Tokyo, the Supreme Council for the Direction of the War gathered on August 9th. 3 days had passed since Hiroshima. Soviet tanks were pouring across the Manchurian border, and now reports arrived of a second atomic bomb, this one obliterating Nagasaki. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo looked around the table at the men who had led Japan into this war. Army Minister Korichika Anami still argued for continuing the fight, for the glory of Ketsugo, the final defense of the homeland that would inflict such casualties on the Americans that they would accept terms. Admiral Toyota maintained that the United States couldn't possibly have more than a few atomic bombs. But Togo had been reading intelligence reports. He had seen the photographs of American supply depots in the Pacific, mountains of canned food, forests of fuel drums, aircraft parked in rows that stretched to the horizon. He had studied the production figures that Japan's own spies had confirmed. In 3 years following the Battle of Midway, Japan had built 6 aircraft carriers. America had built 17. In 1944 alone, the United States had produced more planes than Japan had built during the entire war. "Gentlemen," Togo said, his voice cutting through the debate, "we have been operating under a fundamental delusion." The room fell silent. "We believed that America was fighting at full capacity, that every victory we won, every ship we sank, every plane we shot down, brought them closer to exhaustion." He placed a folder on the table. American Industrial Statistics, obtained at great risk by intelligence services. This is the truth. In 1941, the United States produced 2.6 million automobiles for civilian use. In 1942, they produced 223,000 cars. Not because they lacked the ability to make more, but because they had converted every automobile factory to war production. General Motors made airplane engines. Ford built bombers at a single plant that was larger than anything in Japan. He opened the folder. They produced almost 300,000 aircraft, 193,000 artillery pieces, 86,000 tanks, 2 million military trucks. They built more merchant shipping in 1943 than we sank in the entire war. And while doing all of this, their civilian population's consumption increased. American workers ate more meat in 1943 than they had in 1939. War Minister Anami's face had gone pale. "That's impossible." "It's documented," Togo said quietly, "by our own intelligence services. And now, in addition to outproducing us in every conventional category by factors of 10 or 20 or 50, they have created a weapon that can destroy a city with a single bomb. A weapon that required billions of dollars and thousands of scientists and industrial facilities we could never hope to build." He looked around the table. "We weren't fighting America at full strength. We were fighting America while it fed the Soviet Union, while it supplied Britain, while it maintained higher living standards for its own civilians than we provided for our soldiers. The atomic bomb isn't a new development in this war. It's simply the final proof of what was always true. We never had a chance." The silence that followed was absolute. Admiral Toyota spoke first, his voice barely above a whisper. "Then everything we told ourselves was a lie," Togo finished. "Our strategy assumed American weakness. Our propaganda insisted on their decadence and lack of will. But they weren't weak. They weren't even fighting at full capacity. They were conducting a planetary war on multiple continents while building weapons we thought existed only in theoretical papers." Takeshi learned of the surrender while still in the hospital on Saipan. Around him, Japanese prisoners received the news in stunned silence. Some wept. Some turned their faces to the wall and refused to speak. A few attempted suicide, though American guards prevented most of them. Takeshi simply lay in his clean bed, an IV still feeding him antibiotics, and thought about the rice balls his mother used to make. He wondered if she was alive. Hiroshima was 200 miles from his home village, but the aftermath of such a weapon was unknown. The same American doctor who had shown him the newspaper returned. He sat beside Takeshi's bed, the way he always did, as if they were colleagues rather than enemies separated by barbed wire and history. "It's over," the doctor said. "You'll be going home soon. Once you're well enough." Takeshi found his voice. "Doctor, may I ask you something?" "Of course. Why?" Takeshi gestured around the ward, at the medicine, the food, the care. "You could have let me die on Okinawa. You could have done the minimum and saved your resources for American soldiers." "Why this?" The doctor considered the question for a long moment. "You want the cynical answer or the real one?" "Both." "Cynically? Because we want you to go home and tell everyone what you saw. We want Japan to understand that we can afford to treat our enemies better than your government treated you. That's power, real power. Not just bombs and bullets, but the kind of strength that comes from surplus, from wealth so vast we can spend it on mercy. He paused. But the real answer? Because you're 19 years old and you were following orders and you're somebody's son. And that matters. That has to matter. Otherwise, what are we even fighting for? Takeshi was quiet. Then, I was taught that surrender was the worst thing a Japanese soldier could do, that death was preferable. And now? Now I will go home. I will tell everyone what I saw here. Not because you want me to, but because it's true. Because they should know. The doctor nodded. What will you tell them? Takeshi looked around the ward one more time. At the abundance, the organization, the casual waste that would have sustained a Japanese battalion for a month. At the American flag hanging limp in the tropical heat outside the tent. I will tell them we never understood. We thought the war was about courage, about spirit, about willingness to sacrifice. But you, he struggled for the words, you built a different kind of world, one with so much surplus that you could afford to be merciful. We measured our strength in what we could endure. You measured yours in what you could produce, and there was never any competition. The numbers told a story. That ideology had obscured. In the 6 years of war, Japan had produced 76,000 aircraft. The United States had produced 300,000. Japan had built 12 battleships and carriers combined in the years following Pearl Harbor. America had built 124. The average American worker in 1944 consumed 2,800 calories per day. The average Japanese soldier was starving on less than 1,500. But the atomic bomb had demonstrated something beyond mere production statistics. It had revealed the chasm between what Japan thought was possible and what America had actually achieved. While Japanese scientists had concluded that building an atomic weapon was theoretically possible, but practically impossible given the resources required, America had simply mobilized those resources. The Manhattan Project had employed 130,000 people, cost $2 billion, more than Japan had spent on its entire war effort in 1944, and succeeded. The weapon itself was almost secondary to what it represented. A nation so wealthy, so technically advanced, so industrially powerful that it could pursue multiple simultaneous mega projects while fighting a global war and maintaining higher civilian living standards than its enemies could provide for their soldiers. In prisoner of war camps across the Pacific, Japanese soldiers confronted this reality in countless small ways. The American guards who complained about the quality of their boots, not knowing that Japanese soldiers had marched barefoot. The cans of Coca-Cola consumed casually and tossed away, each one representing more sugar than a Japanese family's monthly ration. The electricity that ran 24 hours a day, the antibiotics that saved lives from infections that would have been death sentences in Japanese field hospitals, the casual abundance that American personnel took so for granted they didn't even notice it. One prisoner, a former aircraft mechanic, spent hours watching American ground crews service B-29s. They replace parts that still work, he told Takeshi in amazement. If an engine has flown 200 hours, they swap it for a new one. Not because it's broken, because it might break. They have so many spare engines that they can afford to replace them before they fail. Another prisoner, who had been captured in the Philippines, described watching American engineers building a road. They had machines, huge machines, bigger than anything we had. One machine did the work of 100 men, and when we built roads, we did it with prisoners and forced labor, men dying of exhaustion and malnutrition. They did it with machines and paid workers, and they built it in a third of the time. The realization spread through the prison camps like a slow fever. Japan hadn't lost because its soldiers lacked courage. It hadn't lost because of poor tactics or weak leadership or a failure of will. It had lost because it had been fighting an enemy that existed on a completely different scale. An enemy whose industrial base was so vast that the war against Japan was a secondary theater, an afterthought requiring only a fraction of American productive capacity. Takeshi returned to Japan in December of 1945, part of a repatriation program that would take years to complete. The destroyer that carried him and 500 other former prisoners pulled into Yokohama harbor on a cold morning, frost on the railings, breath steaming in the air. From the ship's deck, he could see the devastation. Tokyo, visible in the distance, was a landscape of rubble. Yokohama itself had been bombed so heavily that entire districts had simply disappeared. But what struck him most wasn't the destruction. He had expected that. It was the American ships in the harbor, dozens of them, unloading food and medicine and construction equipment. An American officer addressed the returning prisoners before they disembarked. "You're going home to a country that's going to rebuild," he said through a translator. "The war is over. You lost, but America isn't interested in grinding you into the dirt. We're going to help you rebuild, because that's in everyone's interest. The world doesn't need another Versailles. It needs partners." Takeshi wanted to find the cynicism in that, the calculation. But he thought of the doctor who had saved his life, the nurse who had brought him water, the medics who had treated Japanese and American wounded with equal care. The abundance hadn't been propaganda. It had been real. His mother was alive. The letter reached him 3 weeks after his return, written in her careful hand, telling him that his father had died in the February bombing raids on Tokyo, but that she and his younger sister had survived. They were living with relatives in the countryside, hungry but alive. He wrote back immediately. He told her about the hospital, about the food, about the doctor. He told her about the things he had seen that had shattered everything he'd been taught about the war. He told her that Japan had been fighting a country that could produce more in a week than the empire could produce in a year. "We never understood what we were facing," he wrote, "and because we never understood, hundreds of thousands died for a war we could never have won. Not because we lacked courage or spirit, but because we were living in one world and they were living in another. A world we didn't know existed until it was too late." 20 years later. In 1965, Takeshi sat in a coffee shop in Tokyo, a rebuilt Tokyo, gleaming with new buildings, neon signs, the prosperity of the economic miracle. Across from him sat an American businessman, a partner in a joint venture. The conversation was friendly, professional. "You were in the war?" the American asked. "I was captured on Okinawa," Takeshi said. "That must have been rough." Takeshi thought about how to answer. "It saved my life. I was wounded badly. If I hadn't been captured, I would have died in a field hospital with no medicine, no doctors. Instead, I had surgery within hours. American surgery, American medicine. I lived because of that." The businessman looked uncomfortable. "Well, I'm glad you made it. What you should understand," Takeshi said gently, "is that the atomic bombs, they get all the attention. But they weren't why Japan surrendered. Not really. We surrendered because reality finally caught up with propaganda. Because we finally understood that America wasn't a weak, decadent enemy on the verge of collapse. It was an empire of production, wealth on a scale we couldn't imagine." He gestured around the coffee shop, at the modern appliances, the abundance, the prosperity that had seemed impossible in 1945. The bomb was just proof. Final, irrefutable proof that you could do things we thought were impossible. That's what broke us. Not the fear of more bombs, though that was part of it, but the knowledge that we had been fighting a fantasy, that the America in our propaganda had never existed. And the real America, he paused, the real America we never had a chance against. The businessman was quiet. Then, "I think a lot of Americans still don't understand how close we came to having to invade. The casualties would have been—" "I know," Takeshi interrupted. "I was part of Ketsugo, the final defense. We were prepared to fight to the last man, woman, and child. Millions would have died, Japanese and American both. The bombs saved lives. Japanese lives, most of all." He took a sip of his coffee, good coffee, strong and hot, the kind of thing that had seemed like an impossible luxury in 1945. "The irony," he said, "is that if we had understood from the beginning what we were really facing, the war never would have started. Japan thought it was gambling on American will, betting that you would quit before committing fully. But you were never not committed. You were just getting started." The lesson of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Wasn't the destructive power of atomic weapons, though that was real enough. It was the revelation of what had been true all along, That World War II in the Pacific had been a contest between realities, between Japan's vision of warfare based on spirit and sacrifice, and America's vision based on industrial production and unlimited resources. Japan had calculated that it could seize a defensive perimeter, make the cost of reconquest so high that America would negotiate. The calculation was based on an assumption that America was already fighting at capacity, that every loss brought it closer to exhaustion. But America in 1941 hadn't been fighting at capacity. It had been fighting at a fraction of capacity. The Depression-era economy with 17% unemployment had been a coiled spring waiting for pressure. When war came, unemployment vanished. Factories that had been idle roared to life. Women entered the workforce by the millions. The economy didn't strain under the weight of war production. It boomed. The atomic bomb was simply the final illustration of this reality. While Japan struggled to feed its soldiers, America had diverted billions and the labor of thousands to a project that existed only on the frontiers of theoretical physics. While Japanese factories desperately recycled scrap metal, America was building cities in the desert to refine uranium. While Japanese civilians starved on 1,200 calories per day, American workers consumed 2,800 calories and complained about rationing. The gap hadn't narrowed during the war. It had widened. Every month, every year, American production increased while Japanese production declined. By 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy had ceased to exist as a fighting force. The merchant marine had been destroyed. Cities had been burned. Industry had been bombed into rubble, and America had only just begun to mobilize its full potential. Takeshi understood this because he had lived it. He had been there when the illusion shattered, when the gap between what he'd been taught and what actually existed became undeniable. The hospital on Saipan had been his introduction to a different world, a world where even prisoners ate better than he ever had as a soldier, where medicine was abundant enough to waste on enemies, where the casual surplus was greater than anything his officers had claimed was possible. And then came Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the final unavoidable truth. Japan had been fighting a country that could afford to be merciful to its prisoners while simultaneously building weapons that existed beyond the edge of imagination. The two facts were connected. The mercy and the bombs both flowed from the same source, surplus so vast it could be directed towards seemingly contradictory ends. Takeshi died in 1998. At the age of 73, his children and grandchildren gathered for the funeral at a Buddhist temple in suburban Tokyo. The Japan he left behind bore no resemblance to the Japan he had fought for. It was wealthy, peaceful, democratic, an ally of the United States it had once tried to destroy. In his final years, he had sometimes been asked to speak at schools about the war. He always accepted. The story he told never changed. Not about battles or tactics or military strategy, but about a hospital on an island and the moment when everything he believed proved false. The atomic bomb gets remembered, he would tell the students, young faces staring up at him, trying to imagine a world that seemed impossibly distant. But what you should remember is why the bomb was possible. America could afford to build it because it had already built everything else, because it had a productive capacity we couldn't comprehend. That's the lesson. He would pause, looking at the students, at their comfortable clothes and full bellies, an easy assumption that tomorrow would be like today, that the abundance they knew had always existed. We fought a war based on our own reality, he would say, but the other side had a different reality entirely. And in the end, reality won. It always does. In the drawer of his desk, preserved in plastic, was a single piece of paper, the menu from the hospital on Saipan, dated May 1945. He had kept it for 53 years, this list of meals that had seemed impossible then and ordinary now. Scrambled eggs and bacon, beef stew, cake for dessert. He kept it not as a reminder of defeat, but as evidence, as proof of what was possible when a society organized all its resources toward a goal. The menu was more powerful than any weapon, more convincing than any propaganda. It was truth rendered in butter and fresh vegetables and meat 3 times a day. The atomic bomb had destroyed Hiroshima, but it was this casual abundance, this surplus so vast it extended even to enemies, that had destroyed the Japan that had started the war. The bomb had simply made it impossible to deny any longer. That was the moment. Not when the flash lit up the morning sky over Hiroshima, not when the mushroom cloud climbed into the stratosphere, not when the second bomb fell on Nagasaki 3 days later. The moment was when reality, patient, inexorable, undeniable, finally shattered the illusion. When the men who had led Japan into war could no longer maintain the fantasy they had sold to millions. When the gap between what they had believed and what actually existed became too wide to bridge with propaganda or hope or promises of spiritual victory. The moment was when they understood, truly understood, that they had been fighting a war not just on battlefields and oceans, but between two different worlds, and that their world, built on sacrifice and spirit and the willingness to die, had encountered a world built on surplus and production and the ability to create. There could only ever be one outcome from such a meeting. The only question had been how long it would take for everyone to see it clearly.